I remember that night well. It was a cold, windy night in our tough neighborhood. My name is Mary, and I was just 12 years old then. I lived with my mom and my little brother Tommy. Dad was away for work, like he often was, and we were used to handling things ourselves. But this night was different. It was very late, maybe around midnight. The wind howled outside, and the trees cast spooky shadows on the walls. Tommy and I were already in bed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when suddenly I heard a noise. It was a soft knock on the front door. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then I heard it again. My heart started to race. Who could it be at this hour? I crept out of bed and peeked down the hallway. I saw Mom standing still, listening. She looked worried. "Stay in your room, Mary," she whispered when she saw me. But I couldn't move. I watched as helped to the closet and pulled out Dad's old shotgun. My mom had never looked so scared. She held the gun tightly and strolled to the door. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer, just more knocking. She looked through the peephole but saw nothing. Mom took a deep breath and opened the door just a crack. There was no one there. She shut the door quickly and locked it, her hands trembling. "Go back to bed, Mary," she said. But I could tell she was scared too. I went back to my room, but I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening to every sound. The next morning, we saw something strange outside. There were footprints in the dirt near our house. They were big, like a man's, but they were odd, like he had been dragging something heavy. We also found barbed wire tangled in the bushes near our front yard. It was rusty and sharp, and it made me shiver. Mom called the police, and they came to our house. They looked at the footprints and the barbed wire and took pictures. The police officers talked to Mom for a long time. I could tell they were worried too. They told us to be careful and to keep the doors and windows locked. We thought about what happened all day. Tommy didn't understand much, but he knew something was wrong. He stayed close to Mom and me, his little hand holding mine tightly. That night, we didn't sleep much. Every sound made us jump. A few days later, we learned something that made things even scarier. We had a neighbor who lived a few houses down. He was an old man named Mr. David. He always seemed a bit strange, but we didn't think much of it. But then, one of our other neighbors told us something that made my blood run cold. "Mr. David has been acting red lately," Mrs. Peters said. "I saw him walking around at night, carrying something big and heavy. He didn't look right." Mom thanked her and hurried us inside. She looked more worried than ever. "We need to be careful," she said. "Stay close and don't go outside alone." We started noticing more strange things. Sometimes we would hear noises outside at night, like someone walking around our house. Once, Tommy found a weird old doll in our backyard. It was dirty and broken, and it made me feel sick to look at it. Mom called Dad and told him everything. He said he would come home as soon as he could, but it would be a few more days before he could get back. We had to stay safe until then. One night, I woke up to the sound of glass breaking. I jumped out of bed and ran to Mom's room. She was already up, holding the shotgun. "Stay behind me," she said. We walked slowly to the living room, where the sound came from. The window was broken, and the cold wind blew in. Mom pointed the shotgun at the broken window, her hands shaking. "Who's there?" she called out. There was no answer. We heard footsteps running away, and then it was quiet. Mom called the police again, and they came quickly. They searched around the house, but didn't find anyone. "We need to leave," Mom said after the police left. "It's not safe here." We packed our things quickly. Mom called Dad and told him what happened. He agreed we should leave. We went to stay with my aunt and uncle for a while. It felt safer there, but I still had nightmares about that night. A few days later, Dad finally came home. He hugged us tightly, and I felt safe for the first time in days. He talked to the police and David. The police found out that Mr. David had been sneaking around our house. He had a history of troubling behavior, and they took him in for questioning. We never went back to that house. We moved to a new neighborhood, far away from Mr. David and the scary nights. It took a long time for us to feel safe again, but we were together, and that was what mattered. I still think about that night sometimes. The knock on the door, the footprints, the barbed wire, it all feels like a bad dream, but it taught me to be brave and to trust my family. No matter what, we would always protect each other. I don't work in a motel, but my job requires me to travel a lot. Recently, I had to spend a few nights in a motel that I knew well. It was an old, charming place in a quiet town. My aunt and uncle had owned it, and I had many fond memories of staying there as a child. The motel hadn't changed much over the years. The wooden floors still creaked, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. My room was on the second floor, facing the courtyard. It was cozy, with a large bed covered in a quilt, a wooden dresser, and a small writing desk by the window. I liked to leave the window slightly open at night to let in the cool breeze and the soothing sounds of the fountain below. On the first night, I fell asleep quickly, but around midnight, I woke up to the sound of furniture being moved in the room above mine. It was a slow, dragging noise like someone was pushing a heavy chair across the floor. At first, I thought it was just another guest rearranging things, but the noise continued for hours. I put a pillow over my head, but it didn't help. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep out of sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to the receptionist, a young woman with a kind smile. She looked puzzled and told me that the room above mine was empty. No one had stayed there for weeks. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the sound had come from somewhere else. Maybe the old pipes were acting up. That night, the same thing happened. Just as I was drifting off, the noise started again. The scraping and dragging of furniture echoed through the ceiling. This time I was too curious to ignore it. I put on my slippers and went to the lobby to find the night security guard. He was an older man with a calm demeanor, and he agreed to check the room above mine. We took the creaky elevator to the third floor. The hallway was dimly lit, and the carpet muffled our footsteps. The guard unlocked the door, and we stepped inside. The room was empty, just as the receptionist had said. The furniture was in its usual place, covered in a thin layer of dust. There were no signs of anyone having been there. We returned to the lobby, and the guard assured me he would keep an eye on things. I went back to my room, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining the furniture above me moving on its own, like some unseen force was rearranging the room. The next day, I was exhausted and decided to switch rooms. The motel staff was understanding and moved me to the opposite wing, far away from the source of the noise. My new room was just as cozy, with a view of the garden instead of the courtyard. For the first time in days, I felt at ease. I took a long, hot shower and settled into bed with a book. The night was quiet, and I started to relax, thinking the worst was over. But just as I began to drift off, I heard it again. The same dragging sound, but this time it was coming from above my new room. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there listening to the eerie noise. It seemed to move around, as if someone was deliberately trying to disturb me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk. The receptionist sounded concerned and said she would send the security guard up immediately. Within minutes, there was a knock on my door. It was the same guard, looking even more serious than before. We went upstairs together, but once again, the room above mine was empty. The guard checked every corner, but there was nothing unusual. He suggested I try to get some rest and assured me he would patrol the halls throughout the night. Back in my room, I felt a sense of hopelessness. What was causing these noises? Why did they follow me to the other side of the motel? I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. The sound continued, relentless and unnerving. As dawn approached, the noise finally stopped, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, the sun was shining, and everything seemed normal again. I packed my bags and checked out of the motel, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering unease. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. The motel that once felt like a second home now seemed shrouded in mystery and dread. I wondered if I would ever find out what had caused those noises, but part of me was glad to leave it behind. To this day, I think about that experience whenever I stay in a motel. The memory of those nights, the sound of furniture moving in an empty room, still haunts me. It's a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and that some places, no matter how familiar, can hide secrets in their shadows. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. In 2019, I was 13 years old and living near a forest with my family. We had a cozy house surrounded by tall trees, which always seemed to whisper secrets. One night, my life changed forever. It was a stormy night. Rain tapped against the windows, and lightning flashed across the sky. My mom, brother, and sister were at the hospital with my dad, who was very sick. I was home alone, trying to be brave. I sat on the couch watching TV to distract myself. The house felt big and empty without my family. The shadows seemed darker, and the sounds of the storm outside made everything scarier. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, and I tried to focus on the show. Suddenly, I heard it. Someone called my name. "Tommy," a voice whispered from upstairs. I froze. The TV was still on, but I couldn't hear it anymore. The voice sounded so clear, so real. I turned off the TV and listened. "Tommy," the voice called again. My heart raced. Who could it be? I was supposed to be alone. I gathered my courage and decided to check. I slowly walked up the creaky wooden stairs, each step making a loud noise. The hallway was dark, and I had to turn on the light. I went to my room first. It was empty, just as I left it. I checked my brother's room next. It was also empty. The voice seemed to come from the end of the hallway, from my parents' room. The door was slightly open. I pushed it and peered inside. The room was dark, with only the dim light from the hallway spilling in. I stepped inside and called out, "Hello?" No one answered. I checked the closet and under the bed, but there was no one there. I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice had sounded so close, but now it was gone. Feeling uneasy, I decided to go back downstairs. As I turned to leave the room, I saw something from the corner of my eye. A shadow moved outside the window. My heart pounded, and I felt frozen in place. I slowly walked to the window and looked outside. The rain was pouring down, making it hard to see clearly. But then, a flash of lightning lit up the yard. There, standing near the edge of the forest, was a figure. It was too dark to see who it was, but I knew someone was there. Panic set in. I rushed downstairs and locked all the doors. I grabbed the phone to call my mom, but there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the service. I felt trapped and scared. I decided to stay in the living room, where I could see both the front and back doors. I turned off the lights so I could see outside better. I sat on the couch, clutching a flashlight, waiting for something to happen. Minutes felt like hours. The storm raged on, and I kept glancing at the windows. Then I heard a noise. It was a soft tapping sound coming from the back door. I turned towards it, and my heart skipped a beat. There, through the glass door, I saw the figure again. It was closer this time, standing right on the porch. The lightning flashed again, and I could see a face. It was pale, with dark eyes staring directly at me. I screamed and fell back, dropping the flashlight. I scrambled to pick it up, but when I shone it at the door, the figure was gone. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with fear and confusion. I decided to hide. I ran to the closet under the stairs and crawled inside. I closed the door and tried to calm my breathing. I could hear the rain pounding on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Time passed slowly. I stayed as quiet as I could, listening for any signs of the intruder. My mind played tricks on me, making me think I heard footsteps and whispers. I was too scared to move. Finally, exhaustion took over and I drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up to the sound of voices. They were calling my name, but these voices were familiar. I opened the closet door and peeked out. The storm had passed, and the house was filled with light. I stepped out cautiously and saw my mom, brother, and sister standing in the living room. They looked worried and relieved. "Tommy, are you okay?" my mom asked, rushing over to hug me. I nodded, feeling tears in my eyes. I heard someone calling my name from upstairs, and I saw someone outside, I said, my voice trembling. My mom hugged me tightly. "It's okay, Tommy. We're here now. You're safe." I looked around the room, still feeling uneasy. The house seemed normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened. My mom said it was probably just my imagination fueled by the storm and being alone. But deep down, I knew what I saw and heard. That night left a mark on me, a memory that would never fade. Even now, years later, I can still hear that voice calling my name and see the figure standing in the rain. It was a stormy night, and I was alone. I decided to go camping alone in the woods. I wanted some peace away from the busy city. I packed my camping gear, food, and my trusty old rifle for safety. I drove to a remote camping spot deep in the forest. It was a place I had been to a few times before, but I had never camped there alone. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was still up, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were the birds chirping and the rustle of leaves. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. It was a perfect spot, far away from any trails or other campers. After setting up my tent and arranging my things, I decided to collect some firewood. The sun was starting to set, and I wanted to have a fire ready before it got dark. I walked through the woods, picking up dry branches and twigs. As I ventured further from my camp, I noticed something strange. From a distance, I saw someone walking through the woods. It was odd because this person was not on the trail. They were moving slowly, almost aimlessly, through the dense forest. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who could it be? Why were they walking through the woods like that? I shook off the uneasy feeling and continued collecting wood. I told myself it was probably another camper exploring the area. I gathered enough wood and headed back to my campsite. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit the fire. The flames danced and crackled, bringing warmth and light to the clearing. I cooked a simple meal and sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude. The forest around me was dark, and the stars began to appear in the night sky. It was peaceful, and I started to relax. After finishing my meal, I decided to get some sleep. I put out the fire, leaving just a few glowing embers, and crawled into my tent. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I felt safe in my tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke up to a strange sound. It was a soft, melodic whistling. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the whistling continued. It seemed to be coming from just outside my camp. My heart started to race. Who could be whistling out here in the middle of the night? I grabbed my rifle and slowly unzipped the tent. The whistling stopped as soon as I stepped out. I looked around, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. The fire had died down, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon. I listened carefully, but all I could hear was the sound of my breathing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was a man, barely visible in the darkness. He was just standing there watching me. I felt a surge of fear and instinctively lifted my rifle. The man didn't move. I called out, my voice shaky, "Who's there?" There was no response. The man just stood there, silent and still. I kept my rifle pointed at him, my finger on the trigger. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Then, slowly, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest. I kept my rifle raised, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away. I didn't go back to my tent. I stayed by the fire, feeding it more wood to keep it burning brightly. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, my eyes darting around, watching the shadows. The whistling didn't return, and I didn't see the man again. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my camp. I didn't want to stay another moment in that place. I hiked back to my car, my heart still pounding from the encounter. The drive back home felt longer than usual, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. When I got home, I told my friends about what happened. Some of them laughed it off, saying it was probably just another camper messing with me. Others suggested it could have been a local or even a hunter. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Something was unsettling about that man, the way he stood there watching me in the dark. I haven't been back to that camping spot since. The woods, once a place of peace and solitude, now felt eerie and dangerous. The memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder of how vulnerable we can be when we're alone in the wild. I was working the night shift at the gas station. The hours were long and the nights were quiet. Most of the time, nothing exciting happened. I would clean the counters, stock the shelves, and help the occasional customer who needed gas or a snack. But one night, something happened that I will never forget. It started like any other night. I was behind the counter, reading a book to pass the time. It was around midnight, and the gas station was empty. The bright lights inside made the darkness outside seem even darker. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing by on the highway. Suddenly, I saw bright headlights outside. A car pulled up to the pump, but no one got out. I watched for a moment, waiting to see if the driver would come inside. After a few minutes, the door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and thin, with messy hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. He walked slowly, almost stumbling towards the door. When he came inside, I noticed he was jittery. His hands were shaking, and he kept looking around nervously. Something about him didn't seem right. He walked up to the counter and stared at me without saying a word. His eyes were wide and intense, and I could see sweat on his forehead. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He didn't answer. Instead, he just kept staring at me. I felt my heart start to race. I didn't know what to do. I glanced at the phone, wondering if I should call for help. But before I could make a decision, he spoke. "Do you have a bathroom?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Yes, it's in the back," I said, pointing to the door at the end of the aisle. He nodded and walked towards the bathroom, still looking around nervously. I watched him go, feeling uneasy. Something about him was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to reading my book, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept glancing at the bathroom door, waiting for him to come out. Minutes passed, and he still didn't come out. I started to feel even more uneasy. What was he doing in there? I decided to check. I walked slowly towards the bathroom door, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked lightly. "Is everything okay in there?" I asked. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked again. Still no answer. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. What if something had happened to him? I hesitated for a moment, then decided to open the door. I pushed it open slowly and peeked inside. The bathroom was empty. He was gone. I felt a chill run down my spine. Where had he gone? I looked around the gas station, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I went back to the counter, feeling more uneasy than ever. I decided to call my manager, just to let him know what was going on. As I reached for the phone, I saw headlights outside again. Another car was pulling up to the pump. This time it was a cab. The driver got out and walked towards the door. He was an older man with a friendly smile. He came inside and looked around. "Busy night?" he asked, walking up to the counter. "Not really," I said, trying to smile. "Just had a weird customer a few minutes ago." "Oh, what happened?" he asked, looking concerned. I told him about the jittery man and how he had vanished from the bathroom. The cab driver listened carefully, nodding as I spoke. "That sounds strange," he said. "You should be careful. You never know what kind of people are out there." "I know," I said, feeling a little better talking to him. "Thanks for the advice." "No problem," he said, smiling again. "If you need anything, I'll be around. Just honk if you need help." "Thanks," I said, feeling a little safer knowing he was nearby. The cab driver went back to his car, and I watched as he drove away. I felt a little better, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I went back to reading my book, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept looking around, half expecting the jittery man to reappear. Hours passed, and nothing else happened. The gas station remained quiet, and I tried to relax. But just when I thought the night would end without any more scares, I saw headlights outside again. My heart skipped a beat as the same car from earlier pulled up to the pump. The jittery man got out again, looking even more nervous than before. He walked towards the door, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I glanced around, hoping the cab driver was still nearby. But there was no sign of him. The jittery man came inside and walked up to the counter. He stared at me again with those wide, intense eyes. I felt my hands start to shake, but I tried to stay calm. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. He handed it to me without a word. I took it, my hands shaking. The paper was old and worn, with writing that was hard to read. It looked like some kind of map. "What is this?" I asked, confused. He didn't answer. He just kept staring at me with those intense eyes. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I didn't know what he wanted, and I didn't want to find out. "I think you should leave," I said, trying to sound brave. He didn't move. He just kept staring at me. I felt my heart start to race. I glanced around, hoping to see the cab driver, but there was no sign of him. I didn't know what to do. Just then, I heard a honk outside. I looked up and saw the cab driver's car. He had come back. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The cab driver got out of his car and walked towards the door. The jittery man glanced at him, then back at me. He looked even more nervous now. "Is everything okay here?" the cab driver asked, looking at the jittery man. The jittery man didn't answer. He just turned and walked out the door without a word. I watched as he got into his car and drove away, the bright headlights disappearing into the darkness. "Are you okay?" the cab driver asked, walking up to the counter. "I think so," I said, still shaking. "Thank you for coming back." "No problem," he said, smiling. "I told you if you need anything, just honk." "Thanks," I said, feeling a little better. The cab driver stayed with me for the rest of my shift, and nothing else happened. When morning came, I thanked him again, and he drove away. I never saw the jittery man again. but I never forgot that night. It was the scariest night of my life, and I was glad I had someone there to help me through it. It was a stormy night. Rain pounded against the windows, and thunder roared like a beast in the sky. I was visiting my mom at her workplace, a large office building that felt eerily empty after hours. My mom worked late shifts often, and since I had nowhere else to be, I would sometimes keep her company. The office was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan the building makes. I sat at a desk in the corner, doing my homework, while my mom typed away at her computer. The light from her desk lamp cast long shadows that danced across the room with every flicker of the lightning outside. After a while, I felt the need to use the washroom. My mom pointed me in the direction of the restrooms, which were located in another part of the building. I walked through the dimly lit hallways, my footsteps echoing in the space. The sound of the storm outside was muffled but still present, a constant reminder of the tumultuous weather. As I reached the washroom, I noticed how different this part of the building felt. It was older, with faded wallpaper and flickering fluorescent lights. The air was cooler here, almost as if it was disconnected from the rest of the building. I pushed open the door to the washroom and stepped inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, casting an unsettling glow over the room. There were 3 stalls, all of them empty, and a row of sinks with a large mirror above them. As I washed my hands, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. I looked up and saw a woman standing behind me. She wore a white hijab that seemed to glow in the flickering light. Her expression was unreadable, and she stood so still that it was almost as if she was a statue. But I managed to smile at her before quickly leaving the washroom. I hurried back to my mom's desk, my heart pounding in my chest. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, and the shadows in the office looked darker. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I sat back down and continued my homework. Later, I mentioned the woman to my mom. I described her white hijab and how she stood so still. My mom glanced up from her work, a puzzled expression on her face, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded and returned to her typing. I thought it was strange, but I didn't press the issue. I assumed the woman was just a coworker working late, like my mom. The night dragged on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Eventually, my mom finished her work, and we prepared to leave. As we gathered our things, my mom suddenly spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "You said you saw a woman in a white hijab?" she asked, not looking at me. "Yeah," I replied, "in the washroom." "Why?" My mom took a deep breath and turned to face me. "None of my co-workers wear white hijabs. No one here wears white hijabs at all." "Are you sure you saw her?" A cold shiver ran down my spine. I nodded, remembering the way the woman had stood so still, her eyes fixed on me in the mirror. My mom's expression grew more serious. She led me to the security office, where we asked to see the camera footage from the hallway outside the washroom. The security guard, a gruff man with a thick mustache, was reluctant at first, but my mom's insistence won him over. We watched the footage together, the grainy black and white images showing the empty hallway. I saw myself walk to the washroom and go inside. A few minutes later, I came out, looking slightly pale and hurried, but there was no sign of the woman in the white hijab. No one else had entered or left the washroom during that time. The security guard shrugged and muttered something about the cameras not catching everything, but I could see the concern in my mom's eyes. She thanked the guard, and we left the office in silence. The drive home was tense. The storm continued to rage, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the torrential rain. My mom kept glancing at me, her expression a mix of worry and confusion. I didn't know what to say. The woman had been so real, so present, and yet there was no trace of her on the footage. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman in the white hijab standing behind me in the mirror, her face expressionless and her eyes dark. The image was burned into my mind, and the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. Over the next few days, my mom tried to reassure me, telling me it was probably just a trick of the light or my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't my imagination. Weeks passed, and I stopped visiting my mom at work. The memory of that night still haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the white hijab was still out there, watching. Last winter, I lived in a quiet neighborhood. My house was small, but it was enough for me. I enjoyed my evenings alone, watching TV or reading a good book. One night in November, something strange happened that I will never forget. It was a cold night. The wind was howling outside and the leaves were rustling. I had just finished dinner and decided to watch a movie. I turned off the lights, made some popcorn, and settled on the couch with a blanket. The movie was about a detective solving a mystery. It was exciting, and I was completely focused on it. Suddenly I heard a noise. It was a soft thud coming from the back of the house. I paused the movie and listened carefully. At first I thought it might be the wind, but then I heard it again. It sounded like something or someone was moving outside. I got up from the couch and walked to the window. I looked out into the dark backyard but saw nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination and went back to the couch. As soon as I sat down, the noise came again, louder this time. My heart started to race. I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and walked to the back door. I opened it slowly and stepped outside. The cold wind hit my face and I shivered. I shined the flashlight around the yard but saw nothing unusual. I was about to go back inside when I heard a whisper. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound brave. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind and the rustling leaves. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly went back inside and locked the door. I returned to the living room, but I couldn't concentrate on the movie anymore. I kept thinking about the noise and the whisper. I decided to go to bed early and forget about it. I turned off the TV, made sure all the doors and windows were locked, and went upstairs to my bedroom. As I lay in bed, I heard the noise again. It was coming from inside the house this time. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat up and listened. The noise was coming from the basement. I had a small basement where I kept some old boxes and tools. I rarely went down there. I knew I had to check it out. I grabbed a baseball bat from my closet and slowly walked downstairs. The noise was getting louder as I approached the basement door. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The basement was dark and cold. I switched on the light and looked around. Everything seemed normal. I was about to go back upstairs when I heard footsteps. They were coming from behind a large pile of boxes. I held the bat tightly and walked toward the boxes. My hands were shaking. As I got closer, I saw a shadow move. I stopped and called out, "Who's there?" A man stepped out from behind the boxes. He was tall and thin, with messy hair and a wild look in his eyes. He was wearing dirty clothes and had a knife in his hand. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I knew I had to get out of there. I swung the bat at him, but he dodged it. He lunged at me with the knife, but I managed to avoid it. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could, with the man right behind me. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it. I ran back to the living room and grabbed my phone from the coffee table. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely dial the number. 911, what is your emergency? The operator asked. There's a man in my house. He's trying to kill me, I shouted. Stay calm. What's your address? She asked. I gave her my address and she said help was on the way. I could still hear the man banging on the basement door. I knew I had to get out of the house before he broke through. I ran out the front door and into the street. It was dark and cold, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be safe. I ran to my neighbor's house and banged on the door. They opened it and let me in. I told them what happened, and they called the police again. We waited for what felt like hours, but it was only a few minutes. The police arrived and went into my house. They found the man in the basement, still trying to break through the door. They arrested him and took him away. The police told me the man was a wanted criminal. He had been hiding in my basement for days, waiting for the right moment to attack. I was lucky to have escaped unharmed. After that night, I couldn't sleep alone in my house. I moved in with a friend for a while until I felt safe again. The memory of that night still haunts me, but I'm grateful to be alive. I learned to always be aware of my surroundings and never take my safety for granted. It was a quiet Thursday night. I had just come home from a long day at work. My feet ached and my mind was tired. I was looking forward to relaxing on the couch and watching some TV. As I opened the door to my apartment, something felt off, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I shrugged it off and went inside. The living room was dark, and I reached for the light switch. As the light flickered on, I gasped. There, sitting on my couch, was a man. He was hunched over, staring at the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt frozen in place. Who was this man? How did he get into my apartment? I took a deep breath and tried to steady my voice. Who are you? What are you doing here? I asked, my voice trembling. The man slowly lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were dark and empty, and his face was pale. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with a blank expression. I took a step back, my mind racing. Should I run? Should I call the police? I grabbed my phone from my bag and dialed 911. As I waited for the operator to answer, the man stood up. He was tall and lanky, and his clothes were dirty and torn. He took a step towards me, and I felt my heart race even faster. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice came through the phone. I tried to stay calm as I explained that there was a stranger in my apartment. The operator assured me that the police were on their way and told me to stay on the line. The man continued to stare at me, not saying a word. I kept my eyes on him, afraid that if I looked away, he might do something. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me as I knew help was on the way. The police arrived quickly and burst into the apartment. The man didn't resist as they took him into custody. I watched as they led him away, still in shock from what had just happened. One of the officers stayed behind to take my statement. I told him everything I knew, which wasn't much. I had no idea who the man was or how he had gotten into my apartment. After the police left, I sat on the couch trying to process what had just happened. I felt a mix of fear and relief. I was safe, but the thought of a stranger being in my home was terrifying. I decided to stay at a friend's house for the night, not wanting to be alone. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. I called the police to see if they had any more information. The officer I spoke to told me that the man was my neighbor from down the hall. His name was Michael, and he had a history of mental illness. He had been off his medication and had wandered into my apartment by mistake. I was shocked. I had seen Michael in passing but had never spoken to him. He always seemed quiet and kept to himself. I couldn't believe that he had been in my apartment. The police assured me that Michael was now in custody and would be getting the help he needed. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but the incident had left me shaken. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I came home, I checked every room to make sure no one was there. I changed the locks on my doors and installed a security system. I wanted to feel safe in my own home again. A few weeks later, I heard from the police again. They told me that Michael had been arrested and was facing charges for breaking. I felt a sense of closure, knowing that he wouldn't be able to come into my apartment again. But I also felt a pang of sadness for Michael. He was a troubled man who needed help, and I hoped that he would get it. Life slowly went back to normal, but I was more cautious. I paid more attention to my surroundings and made sure my doors were always locked. The incident had been a wake-up call, reminding me that even in a quiet neighborhood, unexpected things could happen. Everything to me back then. It was my escape, passion, and way of feeling free. On weekends, I often skate with friends until the sun dipped below the horizon. Those were some of the best moments of my youth, cruising through the city streets with the wind in my face, the sounds of wheels grinding on pavement, and the laughter of my friends echoing around me. One particular weekend night stands out vividly in my memory. It started like any other, with me and my friends skating downtown, showing off our latest tricks and pushing each other to get better. But as the night wore on, the group started to dwindle, with people heading home one by one. Eventually, I decided it was time to head home as well. It was getting late, probably around 10 or 11 p.m. After saying my goodbyes, I hopped on the bus that would take me close to home. My friends didn't live near the bus route I was taking, so I ended up riding alone, gazing out the window at the blur of city lights as we sped through the streets. The city was still bustling, but the night had a way of making everything feel eerily quiet and empty, like the calm before a storm. When I got off at my stop, I found myself on a major street that ran east to west. The bus stop was about a 2-minute walk from my house, which sat on a quieter street that faced north to south. As I stepped off the bus, the city seemed to grow silent behind me. I started walking toward home, the only sound being the rhythmic footsteps on the pavement. The night air was cool, and a light breeze rustled the leaves in the trees lining the street. As I approached the intersection that connected the major street to my own, something caught my eye. A figure appeared, emerging from a street that bent further down in front of the elementary school near my house. It was a man on a bike, and he seemed to materialize out of the shadows as if the night itself had conjured him. The street he came from led to a pathway near a creek, a place I knew well, but seeing someone appear from there at this hour made me uneasy. My instincts immediately kicked in, telling me something wasn't right. It wasn't uncommon to see people out at night, but there was something about this man's presence that made my stomach tighten with anxiety. He didn't belong there, not at this time, and not on that street. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread, but it clung to me like a shadow. As I walked, I noticed him speeding up, and then I heard him shout, "Hey!" His voice echoed through the quiet street, and the sound of it sent a jolt of fear through me. This wasn't just a passerby, something was wrong, and I knew it. My heart began to pound in my chest as adrenaline surged through my veins. I was almost at my house, but I didn't want to lead him there. My home was my sanctuary, the place where I felt safe, and I didn't want to bring this potential threat anywhere near it. I kept walking, trying to maintain my composure, but my mind was racing, trying to calculate my next move. He was getting closer, and within moments, he caught up to me, stopping his bike right in front of the school and blocking my path. I could feel my breath catch in my throat as I sized him up. He was much larger and more built than I was, easily twice my size. I was a small, skinny kid for my age, and this guy looked like he was in his late 30s or early 40s. The age difference only made the situation more intimidating. Why was a grown man following a teenage boy down a dark street at this hour? The man asked me where I was going. His voice slurred slightly, making me suspect he might be intoxicated. There was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I responded with a snarky comment, trying to mask my fear with false bravado. I told him it didn't matter where I was going, hoping that my attitude would dissuade him from bothering me any further. But instead of backing off, he leaned in closer and asked if I wanted to go behind the school and hang out with him. My heart nearly stopped at his words. The thought of being alone with this stranger behind a dark, deserted school filled me with terror. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I considered using my skateboard as a weapon, but I wasn't sure if it would be enough to defend myself against someone his size. What if I missed it? What if I only made him angrier? In my desperation, I tried to call 911, but to my disbelief, the line was busy. Panic surged through me, and I gripped my skateboard tighter, my knuckles turning white. I was running out of options, and my mind was spiraling into worst-case scenarios. Could I outrun him? Would anyone hear me if I screamed? I thought about banging on doors and yelling for help, but the houses around me were dark and silent. It felt like I was completely alone, trapped in this nightmare with no way out. As I frantically scanned the street for any sign of help, I spotted an older woman walking on the other side of the sidewalk behind me, about 70 feet away. She was like a beacon of hope in the darkness, and without thinking, I bolted toward her, shouting for help. The man on the bike followed me, but I didn't care. I needed to reach that woman, and I needed to reach her fast. When I got to her, I begged for her assistance, my voice shaking with fear. But to my dismay, she was defensive, clearly frightened by the sudden approach of two strangers in the middle of the night. She told me to leave her alone, but I couldn't just walk away. I noticed she had an accent, and on a hunch, I asked if she spoke Polish, a language I had learned from my family. When she replied yes, it felt like a lifeline. I quickly explained the situation to her in Polish, my words tumbling out in a rush. The moment she understood what was happening, her demeanor changed. She softened, and for the first time that night, I felt a sliver of hope. The woman urged me to call 911, and I told her about the busy line earlier. She insisted that I try once more, and as I reached for my phone, I noticed the man on the bike backing off. He muttered something about not wanting any trouble before turning and pedaling away toward the school, disappearing into the darkness. My heart was still pounding, but the immediate threat was gone. I eventually got through to 911 and reported the incident. They assured me that they would send the police to search the area. But later, when they called back, they told me that they hadn't found anyone matching the description I gave them. The man had vanished as quickly as he had appeared. That night was the scariest experience of my life. If that woman hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened. I'm incredibly grateful to her and thankful that nothing worse occurred. It was a real turning point for me in how I view personal safety. Before that night, I never really thought about how vulnerable I could be. But the incident opened my eyes to the dangers that exist, even in familiar places. Delivering pizzas is usually an easy, routine job, and Mr. Pellin was my most reliable customer. Every Thursday night, without fail, he ordered the same thing, a large pepperoni pizza with extra cheese. He lived in an old, crumbling house on the edge of town, surrounded by thick trees that gave it an eerie, isolated feeling. I never really saw Mr. Pellin. He was a recluse. Instead of answering the door, he used a rope sled system from his porch to the driveway. I would place the pizza on the sled, and he'd pull it up from inside his house. It was strange, but that was just his routine. On Thursday evening, I got a call from Mr. Pellin himself, which was unusual. He normally places his order online. This time, he asked for 2 pizzas and mentioned something odd. He said he still wanted me to use the sled system, but there was something in his voice that made me uneasy. It felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I pushed the thought aside. I assumed he just had a guest over and wanted extra food. I made the drive to his house, the familiar dark road winding through the woods. The house came into view, as it always did, with the porch light glowing dimly in the distance. But this time, something was wrong. The rope sled wasn't lowered. It was always hanging there, waiting for the pizza. I stood by my car, pizzas in hand, staring up at the house. It was silent, too silent. I slowly walked toward the porch, expecting the sled to drop down at any moment. But it didn't. The house seemed to stare back at me, dark and still. That's when I noticed movement, a shadow near the basement window. My breath caught in my throat. A figure, masked and hunched, was lurking by the window. They ducked out of sight as soon as they noticed me. A cold wave of fear washed over me. Something was very wrong. I hurried to the side of the house, cautiously peering into the basement window where I had seen the figure. The window was open just a crack, and inside, I could barely make out the shapes of more masked figures moving in the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest. What were they doing? My hand was shaking as I reached for my phone and called the police. I stammered out the situation, explaining that there were people inside Mr. Pellin's house, possibly intruders, and that I had seen a figure by the basement window. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but those few minutes of waiting felt like an eternity. I backed away from the house, pizzas still clutched in my hands. I didn't want to leave Mr. Pellin in there, but I knew I couldn't just storm in and try to help. I was frozen, staring at the basement window when I saw them, the masked figures dragging something heavy through the basement. It was Mr. Pellin. They had him tied up with ropes, and he was struggling weakly. My stomach twisted in fear as I watched them beat him, fists pounding against his frail body. Every thud made my skin crawl and a chill ran down my spine. I had never felt so helpless. All I could do was wait for the police and hope they arrived in time. Minutes later, red and blue lights lit up the street. The police moved quickly, surrounding the house and storming inside. I stayed back, heart racing, as I heard shouts and footsteps from inside. The masked figures tried to escape, but the police were faster. One by one, they were dragged out of the house, their faces hidden behind strange, emotionless masks. There were 3 of them, all dressed in black, but their intentions were still unknown. As the officers led Mr. Pellin out, I felt a wave of relief, though it was mixed with horror. He was alive, but barely. His face was bruised and his body looked battered from the beating he had endured. The ropes had left deep marks on his wrists and ankles, and he could barely walk. I could see the pain in his eyes, even as he tried to maintain some composure. The paramedics rushed him into an ambulance, and the police took the masked men away. But what lingered in the air was the mystery, their reason for attacking Mr. Pellin. No one could figure out why they had targeted him. There was no sign of robbery, no demand for ransom. It was as if they had just come to hurt him, to break him for no reason at all. Later that night, I visited Mr. Pellin in the hospital. He was hooked up to machines, his body covered in bandages. His frail form seemed even smaller in the hospital bed. I stood by his side, not knowing what to say, but he looked at me with a weak smile. If you hadn't called, I don't know what would have happened. A chill ran down my spine as I thought about what I had seen. The masked figures, the brutal beating, the way they had dragged him through his own home like a rag doll. Why had they done this? What had Mr. Pellin done to deserve such violence? The police never did find out their motive. The masked men refused to speak even after their arrest. It was as if they had come to terrorize an old man for the sheer thrill of it. No explanation, no reason. To this day, I still think about that night. Every Thursday, I drive past Mr. Pellin's house, and the memory of those masks haunts me. The fear in Mr. Pellin's eyes, the sound of fists hitting flesh, and the helplessness I felt, it's all burned into my mind. And I can't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, is still watching, waiting for their next victim. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. It was a cold evening, just a few days before Christmas. I had just finished my last lecture of the semester and was finally heading home. The Christmas break was ahead of me, and I couldn't wait to relax. My family had gone to Scotland for the weekend, so I had the house to myself. A quiet weekend alone, or so I thought. As I pulled up to the house, the familiar chill of winter nipped at my face. Snow crunched under my boots as I walked to the front door. The house was dark, with no signs of life. It was a little eerie knowing I would be all alone for the next couple of days, but I was used to it. I liked the peace, especially after the hectic days of university. Once inside, I flicked on the lights and locked the door behind me. The warmth of the house hit me, and I immediately felt more at ease. After throwing my bag down by the door, I headed upstairs to my room. I tossed off my jacket, feeling the weight of the day slowly leaves my shoulders. I was ready for some relaxation. A long hot shower was the first thing on my mind. After my shower, I padded down to the kitchen in my socks, feeling the soft carpet turn to cold tiles beneath my feet. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge. I prepared a quick meal, reheated some leftovers from the fridge, and sat down to eat. Every bite felt like a relief from the stress of the past few weeks. Once I was done, I went back to the living room where my PlayStation sat waiting for me. I turned it on, grabbed my controller, and plugged in my headset. The familiar startup sound filled the room, and I relaxed on the couch. The game pulled me in, and for the first hour I was completely lost in it. But then, something pulled me out of the game. A loud thud echoed from upstairs. I paused, my fingers frozen on the controller. My first thought was that maybe something had fallen. Perhaps I hadn't balanced something properly on my desk, or a stack of books toppled over. I shrugged it off, thinking nothing of it, and returned to my game. Then it happened again. Another thud, this time louder. The sound reverberated through the ceiling, coming directly from my bedroom. It wasn't just the sound that scared me, it was the timing. I was the only one home, and there shouldn't have been any noise coming from upstairs. My heartbeat quickened, and the silence that followed the thud was thick, suffocating almost. I stood there, controller still in my hand, frozen. For a split second I considered going upstairs to check, but fear gripped me tight. What if someone was in the house? What if it wasn't just something falling over? My legs felt like jelly as I hurried across the room, closing and locking the living room door. My hands shook as I turned the key, my heart racing in my chest. The sound had been so sudden, so out of place, that my mind immediately went to the worst possibility. Someone had broken in. I darted over to the window and peeked outside, my breath fogging up the glass. The night was still. Snow fell softly, coating the street in white, and there wasn't a single person in sight. No car lights, no movement. It was like the whole world had paused. But upstairs, something had moved. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I quickly dialed the police. My voice shook as I explained the situation, telling them I thought someone had broken into the house. They assured me they'd send someone over right away. Minutes passed like hours. I could hear the sound of my breathing, loud in the stillness of the room. Every tiny creak of the house settling made me jump. My eyes stayed fixed on the living room door, waiting, listening, terrified that at any moment whoever or whatever was upstairs might come down. Finally, the sound of a car pulling up outside broke the silence. The flashing blue lights reflected off the walls, and a sense of relief washed over me. The police had arrived. I let them in, still shaking from fear. Two officers entered, one immediately heading upstairs while the other stayed with me, asking questions. I could barely speak, my mind still racing with thoughts of what could be up there. I tried to explain the noises, but I wasn't even sure if I had imagined it all in my panic. After about 20 minutes, the officer came back downstairs. His face was calm, but his words sent another wave of fear through me. "There's been a break-in," he said. "The window in your bedroom is open, and it looks like someone came in through there." I felt my stomach drop. I had locked every door, every window before I left for university that morning. Someone had forced their way into my home, into my private space. The officer continued, "It doesn't look like anything's been taken. Whoever it was might have left in a hurry when they heard you come in." I swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. The thudding upstairs wasn't just some random noise. It was someone had been in my house, possibly watching me, waiting, and I had been completely unaware, playing my game as if nothing was wrong. The police searched the rest of the house, but there was no sign of the intruder. They told me to stay somewhere else for the night, just to be safe, but I refused. It was my home, and I didn't want to leave it. But as the officers left and I locked the door behind them, that feeling of safety I once had was gone. I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been in my room, just upstairs while I was sitting down here. The idea haunted me, even after the police left. The house was no longer my sanctuary. It felt violated and unsafe. Back in college, I lived in a small 2-story house just off campus. It wasn't much, but it was cheap, and it was home to me and my roommate, Jason. We were both broke, scraping by on part-time jobs and whatever we could get from student loans. Jason was an okay guy, quiet and kept to himself mostly, but he had some questionable friends. I didn't know much about his life outside of school, but I started to get a bad feeling about one of his buddies. His name was Kyle. I had met Kyle a couple times before. He wasn't someone you'd want to get close to. Always twitchy, looking over his shoulder like he was expecting trouble. He had this rough energy about him, like he could snap at any moment. But Jason seemed to trust him, so I didn't say much. Maybe I should have. It was late one night, around midnight, when I heard heavy footsteps upstairs. I was in my room, trying to study, but the sound made me pause. Jason's voice was muffled, but I could hear it through the walls, talking low and fast. It wasn't unusual for him to have people over, but something about the tone of his voice set me on edge. Then came another voice, Kyle's. I hadn't seen him around for a while, but the moment I heard his voice, I felt uneasy. His words were hurried, desperate even, though I couldn't make out exactly what he was saying. The floorboards creaked as they moved around upstairs. Then, without warning, the door to the basement slammed open. Our basement was nothing more than a cold, damp hole. No one ever went down there, not unless we had to. The concrete floor was cracked, and the old wooden beams groaned every time you walked across them. It always smelled like mold and rot, the kind of place that gave you chills just standing there. The thought of someone being down there made my skin crawl. I left my room and headed toward the staircase, careful not to make any noise. From the top of the stairs, I could hear Jason and Kyle's voices again, clearer this time. They were talking about something serious, something bad. I crept closer, heart pounding, trying to make sense of the conversation. "Just for a few days," Jason said, his voice shaky. "I can't stay out there," Kyle replied. "They're everywhere, man. The cops are looking for me. I need a place to lay low." My breath caught in my throat. Cops? What had Kyle done? My mind raced, but I didn't have to wait long to find out. "I didn't mean to shoot them, all right?" Kyle hissed, anger seeping into his voice. It was supposed to be a quick grab, in and out, but they fought back, and I panicked. I didn't mean to kill them. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Kyle had killed 2 people, in a robbery, and now he was hiding in our house. My hands shook as I gripped the banister, trying to stay calm. This was way beyond anything I could have imagined. I needed to get out, call the police, do something. But fear rooted me to the spot. Downstairs, the basement door creaked open again, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps descending the stairs. Kyle was going down there, into the dark, into the cold, damp basement to hide from the world above. I turned away from the stairs and hurried back to my room, closing the door as quietly as I could. My heart was racing now, thudding in my chest like a drum. What the hell had Jason gotten us into? A murderer was hiding beneath our feet, and Jason was helping him. I sat on my bed, staring at the floor, trying to think of what to do next. If Kyle found out I knew, what would he do? And Jason, how could he let this happen? I felt trapped in my own home. Jason was quieter than usual, avoiding eye contact and acting like nothing was wrong. But I knew better. Every creak in the floor and every whisper of the wind outside made me jump. I could feel Kyle's presence in the basement, lurking just below, like a shadow waiting to emerge. At night, I could barely sleep. The thought of Kyle down there so close, it was suffocating. I kept imagining him sneaking up the stairs, creeping through the house, and slipping into my room. The air felt thick with tension, like the walls themselves were closing in. And then one night I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, on the basement stairs. My heart nearly stopped. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, listening. The footsteps grew louder and heavier until they reached the top of the stairs. I held my breath, waiting for the door to creak open, for Kyle to step out into the hall. But it never came. Instead, the footsteps retreated, back into the darkness below. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the uncertainty, it was eating me alive. I had to do something. Early the next morning, when Jason was still asleep, I grabbed my phone and stepped outside. I called the police, my voice barely above a whisper, telling them everything I knew. It didn't take long for the cops to arrive. They swarmed the house, weapons drawn, moving in with precision. Jason was in shock, frozen as they stormed the place. I watched from the sidewalk, heart pounding in my chest as they made their way to the basement. Kyle didn't go quietly. There was shouting, the sound of a struggle, and then finally they dragged him out in handcuffs. His face was pale, eyes wild with fear and anger. He shot me a look as they shoved him into the back of the squad car. It was a look that chilled me to the bone, a look that told me this wasn't over. Jason moved out a week later. We didn't talk much after that. The house felt different, hollow. Even after Kyle was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling of his presence, like he had left something behind in that basement, something dark and cold that would never truly leave. To this day, I still think about that week, about the moment I realized just how close I had come to danger. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I can still hear those footsteps on the basement stairs. It was late when I left my friend's house. The sky was dark, not a star in sight, and the highway stretched ahead of me, empty and endless. I had been driving for a while, the steady hum of the engine and the quiet of the night making me feel calm. The road was straight, with thick forests on both sides, their tall trees swaying slightly in the breeze. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, but beyond that, there was only blackness. I didn't mind the drive. It was peaceful in a way, the kind of peace that only comes from being alone on an empty road. But as I glanced at the dashboard, my heart skipped a beat. The fuel gauge was lower than I had realized. I had barely any gas left. My mind raced, trying to remember the last gas station I passed. It had been miles back. Too far now. The car started to sputter. The engine struggled, and before I knew it, the car rolled to a stop, right on the side of the highway. I was surrounded by darkness, with only the dense forest on either side. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The silence that had once felt calming now seemed heavy, almost threatening. I quickly locked the doors and pulled my phone out, hoping I could call for help. I had just enough signal to try calling a tow truck. As I waited for a response, I glanced around nervously, the shadows of the trees outside seeming to shift in the faint light. Time passed slowly, and the quiet became unbearable. I tried to distract myself by listening to the soft hum of the wind, but that only made the night seem more eerie. I kept checking the mirrors, scanning the road for any sign of lights or help, but there was nothing, just endless darkness. Suddenly, movement caught my eye. I turned my head quickly, looking out the passenger window. Two figures emerged from the trees on the side of the highway, walking towards my car. My heart pounded in my chest. The two men came closer, and I could see their faces under the faint moonlight. They looked rough and disheveled, as if they had been wandering in the woods for days. They stopped near my car, staring at me through the glass. One of them raised his hand and knocked on the window. "Help us," he said, his voice muffled through the glass. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to keep the doors locked, to stay inside the car. Something didn't feel right. The way they looked at me, their eyes wide with desperation, it made my skin crawl. I didn't trust them. The second man began pulling on the door handle, trying to get in. My heart raced faster. I quickly grabbed my phone again, dialing the police with shaky hands. I explained my situation in a low voice, afraid they might hear me. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but I couldn't help the fear that gripped me. What if they got in before help arrived? The men kept knocking, their hands pressing against the windows now, leaving smudges on the glass. I tried not to look at their faces, tried to ignore the way their eyes seemed to bore into mine. I didn't know how long I had to wait, but it felt like hours before I finally saw the flashing blue and red lights in the distance. Relief washed over me as the police car pulled up behind mine. The officers stepped out, and the two men backed away from my car, retreating slightly into the shadows of the forest. The police spoke to me briefly, asking if I was okay, and I nodded, my heart still racing. "We'll check it out," one of the officers said, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he and his partner moved toward the forest where the men had disappeared. I stayed in the car, my hands still gripping the steering wheel tightly, even though the engine was off. The officers called for the two men to come out, and after a few moments they did. But this time, the men seemed different. They weren't aggressive anymore. They looked defeated, exhausted. They explained something to the officers, and the tension in the air shifted. Curiosity got the better of me, and I rolled down my window slightly to hear what was going on. The men's voices were shaky as they spoke to the police. They weren't trying to rob me. They were running from something far worse. The officers turned back to me, their faces serious. "These men's families were attacked by a group of robbers," one of the officers explained. "They've been hiding in the woods, trying to escape. The robbers are still out there." My stomach twisted at the thought. I wasn't in danger from the men in my car, but from whoever had done this to their families. The officers quickly called for backup, and within minutes, more police cars arrived. They led the two men into safety, while a group of officers, flashlights in hand, ventured into the forest to search for the robbers. I stayed in my car, feeling a cold sweat on my skin as I waited. The idea of those dangerous men lurking somewhere in the dark woods made my heart pound even harder. It wasn't long before the police found them. The robbers were caught hiding deeper in the forest, their faces hard and cruel as they were led out in handcuffs. The officers helped me out of my car, reassuring me that it was safe now. As I stood there on the side of the road, watching the flashing lights and the dark silhouettes of the trees, I felt a chill run down my spine. The night that had once felt so peaceful had turned into something terrifying. I couldn't shake the image of those two men, desperate and afraid, running for their lives. The police thanked me for staying calm, but I didn't feel calm at all. All I wanted was to get home, to leave this dark, empty highway behind. As I got back into my car, with the fuel issue resolved by the officers, I took one last look at the forest, its shadows still deep and endless. I drove away, hoping never to find myself stranded in such darkness again. The night was cold and quiet, and the only sounds were the soft rustling of trees and the distant howl of the wind. I was camping in a remote part of Alaska, deep in the forest, far from civilization. It was just me and my friend Mike, out here in the middle of nowhere. Our tents were set up on the side of an old, unpaved road. We hadn't seen another person for hours. The road was rough and covered in gravel, and it stretched out into the wilderness for miles. It was the kind of place you only went to if you wanted to be alone. No one was supposed to be out here, especially not in the middle of the night. We had gone to bed early, the long day of hiking leaving us both exhausted. The air was cool, but inside my sleeping bag, I was warm and comfortable. I drifted off to sleep quickly, lulled by the peaceful silence of the forest. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the first thing the sound of tires crunching over gravel. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, coming closer. My eyes opened, and I stared at the ceiling of my tent, trying to understand what was happening. It was a car, out here, at this time. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart starting to pound. The sound of the car grew louder, and then I saw headlights through the thin walls of my tent. The car drove past, its lights sweeping over us for just a moment before it disappeared down the road. I lay back down, telling myself it was nothing, just a passing car. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. No one drives down that road in the dead of night. Not in a place like this. The car didn't stop, and for a moment, I thought that was the end of it. But then, the sound came back. The car was returning. I sat up again, my pulse quickening. I could see the lights once more, brighter this time. The car was closer, moving slowly now. I held my breath as the car came to a stop about 40 feet away from our tents. The headlights were pointed directly at us, flooding the campsite with harsh white light. I froze, not sure what to do. The car just sat there idling, its engine rumbling quietly. The light made everything feel exposed, like whoever was inside could see us, but we couldn't see them. Mike was still asleep, unaware of what was going on. I wanted to wake him, but I didn't move. My mind raced, trying to figure out why someone would be out here, why they would stop and shine their headlights at us in the middle of the night. Minutes passed, the car didn't move, the engine hummed, the headlights blinding. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve in my body was on edge, waiting for something to happen. I didn't know whether to hide or get up and confront whoever was out there. Suddenly, the driver's side door opened with a loud creak. I saw the silhouette of a man stepping out of the car. He stood there for a moment, just a dark figure against the glaring light before he started walking toward our tents. I held my breath, my hands gripping my sleeping bag tightly. The man moved slowly, deliberately, his footsteps crunching softly over the gravel. He was getting closer, circling the campsite, almost as if he was inspecting us. The worst part was that he didn't say a word. The only sound was his footsteps and the low rumble of the car's engine. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my body stiff with fear. I wanted to shout to scare him away, but my voice wouldn't come. The man walked around our tents, his shadow flickering in the light. I could see his feet moving through the gap at the bottom of the tent, just inches from where I lay. He circled us, slowly, deliberately, like a predator sizing up its prey. I stayed completely still, hoping he would leave, praying he didn't try to open the tent, or worse. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, without warning, the man stopped. I held my breath, my heart nearly stopping. His footsteps paused right outside my tent. I could hear him breathing, the sound low and steady, too close for comfort. A cold sweat ran down my back. I thought about running, but where would I go? We were in the middle of nowhere. There was no one around for miles. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. After what felt like hours, the man finally moved away. His footsteps grew distant as he walked back to his car. I heard the creak of the door again, and then the engine roared to life. The headlights swung around as the car turned and slowly drove away, disappearing into the night. I stayed frozen in my tent, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. I waited, listening for any sign that the man might come back, but the night was silent once more. Eventually, I let out a long, shaky breath. My hands were trembling, my body tense. I lay there for a long time, too afraid to go back to sleep. Mike stirred beside me, mumbling something, but he didn't wake up. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I couldn't. Every sound, every rustle of the wind made me jump, my mind replaying the scene over and over. Who was that man? What did he want? When the sun finally came up, I felt a wave of relief. The daylight chased away some of the fear, but the memory of that night stayed with me. We packed up our campsite quickly, not saying much to each other. I'll never forget that night, the way the forest felt so much darker, so much colder after he came. My name is Linda, and I've been living alone for more than 2 years now. My husband is in the U.S. Army, stationed overseas. It's hard being alone, but I've gotten used to the silence and the routine of life without him. My dog Max keeps me company. He's a large, protective German Shepherd, and I feel safe with him around. One night, everything changed. It was a Friday evening, and I had just finished cleaning up after dinner. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, making the branches tap against the windows like long, bony fingers. I didn't pay much attention to it. Living alone makes you used to all the small sounds that fill the night. Max lay at my feet as I wiped down the counters in the kitchen. Suddenly, he lifted his head, his ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. Then I heard it, a noise from outside, like footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. It was faint, but enough to send a shiver through me. Max jumped to his feet, barking loudly now, his body stiff as he faced the front door. I walked over to the window, pulling the curtain aside just a little to peek out. The porch light cast a dim glow, but I didn't see anyone. Still, Max wouldn't stop barking, pacing back and forth near the door. I told myself it was probably nothing, just the wind or maybe an animal passing by. "Come on, Max," I said, trying to calm both of us. "It's time for bed." I turned off the lights downstairs and headed upstairs to my bedroom. Max followed me, still alert but quieter now. Once upstairs, I felt a little safer. The house felt smaller and more secure, with the doors locked and the windows shut tight. I got ready for bed, climbed under the covers, and closed my eyes, trying to shake off the unease. Hours passed and I drifted into a light sleep. But then, in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in bed, listening. Max was growling again, this time louder, more aggressive. My breath caught in my throat. The front door had been forced open. I could hear the wind blowing through the open door, and then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moved through the house, downstairs in the living room. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed 911. My hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "Please help," I whispered into the phone, my voice barely audible. "Someone's in my house." I locked the bedroom door, pressing my back against it, as if that could somehow keep me safe. Max stood beside me, growling fiercely, ready to protect me. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, moving from room to room downstairs, as if whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. Then the footsteps stopped. My heart pounded in my ears as I held my breath, waiting, praying that the police would arrive in time. I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder. Relief washed over me, but the fear still clung to me like a cold shadow. The police arrived quickly, and I heard them shouting commands from outside. I stayed locked in my room, too terrified to move. Minutes later, I heard them enter the house, their voices echoing through the halls as they searched each room. Finally, there was a knock on my bedroom door. "Ma'am, it's the police. You're safe now." I unlocked the door, my hands trembling, and opened it to find 2 officers standing there. Max ran out barking at them, but I knew he was only doing his job, protecting me. They told me they had arrested the man downstairs. I followed them down to the living room, my legs feeling weak beneath me. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, the lock completely broken. My house, my safe space, felt violated, like a place I no longer knew. The man they arrested sat in the back of a police car outside. I didn't recognize him. He was disheveled, with wild eyes and a creepy smirk on his face. The officer turned to me, his expression serious. "Ma'am," he said, "we've been looking for this man for a while. He's been following you for weeks. He knew your husband was in the army and that you live alone. He was planning to rob you." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt nauseous, my knees threatening to give out as the reality of the situation sank in. This man had been watching me, tracking my every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I looked at my house, now full of police officers, and it felt foreign, like I didn't belong there anymore. The thought of that man following me, knowing I was alone, filled me with a fear I'd never felt before. The idea that he had been watching me for weeks, lurking in the shadows, made my skin crawl. I work in a small office downtown, nothing fancy, just a few desks, computers, and stacks of paperwork everywhere. Most days are quiet, especially after hours when everyone leaves. But sometimes I have to stay late. It was one of those nights when I experienced something I'll never forget. The office was empty. My coworkers had left hours ago, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. It was already past 9 p.m., and I was trying to finish up some reports that were due the next morning. The soft glow of my computer screen was the only light in the room, casting long shadows across the walls. I felt calm, though the emptiness of the office always gave me a strange feeling. The kind of feeling where you know you're alone, but it feels like someone else is there, watching. I tried to shake it off and focus on my work. I had stayed late many times before, but tonight felt different. It was as if the air had thickened, becoming heavier with each passing minute. After what felt like an hour of typing and staring at spreadsheets, I leaned back in my chair to take a break. That's when I first noticed something odd. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement in the reflection of my computer screen. It was quick, just a dark blur passing behind me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe I had just been staring at the screen for too long. I glanced around the office, expecting to see nothing out of the ordinary. But something caught my attention near the far corner of the room. The shadows seemed darker than usual, as if they were pooling together in one spot. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes, but the darkness didn't go away. It was strange because the room was dim, but not completely dark. There were still a few lights on in the hallway outside, and they usually cast enough light to keep the office from being pitch black. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was just tired, but when I looked again, the dark spot was still there, almost like a shadow that didn't belong to anything. I tried to ignore it and went back to my work, convincing myself that I was just imagining things. But the strange shadow wouldn't leave my mind. Now and then I glanced back at that corner, hoping it would disappear, but it didn't. It seemed to shift slightly, like it was moving. After a few more minutes of this unsettling feeling, I decided to get up and stretch my legs. Maybe walking around would help shake the eerie feeling. As I stood up, I hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The office was still silent, but the air seemed thicker now, like I was being watched. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. I walked towards the small kitchen area at the back of the office, passing by the corner where the shadow had been. As I got closer, I slowed down. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it, like I needed to see if it was there. When I reached the corner, I froze. The shadow wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real, and it was moving. It wasn't a person or anything solid. It was like a mass of darkness, swirling slowly as if it had a life of its own. My heart started pounding in my chest. I wanted to move, to run, but my feet were stuck in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The shadow seemed to stretch, almost like it was reaching out towards me. That's when the air in the room grew even colder. I could see my breath now, small white puffs escaping my lips in the dim light. The shadow crept closer, still swirling but more deliberate now. I felt a deep sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow flickered and vanished. I stood there stunned, my heart racing. The room seemed to lighten again, the cold air slowly fading. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Should I stay? My brain was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't explain it. I quickly gathered my things, not wanting to be in the office any longer than I needed to. As I hurried to the door, I glanced back one last time at the corner. The shadow was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. It was like the darkness had left something behind, a presence that still clung to the air. I practically ran out of the building, my footsteps echoing down the empty hallways. When I finally made it outside, I took a deep breath, the fresh air doing little to calm my nerves. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my car keys. As I drove home, my mind raced, replaying the events over and over. I had no explanation for what I saw, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stay late at the office again anytime soon.